Welcome to this video on qualitative research, produced as part of the Research Methods for Social Science course, School of Environment, Griffith University. The video should be viewed in conjunction with Chapter 7 of the Bryman textbook. The slides associated with this presentation, together with the slides associated with the Bryman text, are available at the Learning at Griffith website. Thinking back to the beginning of this course, we discussed how it is that as individuals within society we understand things. One of the answers to that question was through research. But consider this. Up to now, we have largely discussed quantitative ways of collecting data. We have talked about quantitative-based surveys, content analysis, and the use of existing data. But the question that many researchers ask is just how much does a focus on the quantitative help us understand the society within which we live? There can be little doubt that contemporary society is moving at an increasingly fast pace. New ways of doing things, new ways of working and relating to other people, and even new ways of learning are all making for a complex social world. Unlike many phenomena in the natural world, the context in which social scientists work is less likely to conform to a straight line, is more often messy, and is more likely to be associated with diversity. In this case, it is often argued that although useful, quantitative approaches don't provide a complete picture, and that some qualitative approaches are required to provide a more nuanced understanding. In this presentation, we are going to look at the nature of qualitative research. In the textbook, Bryman describes qualitative research as research that emphasises words rather than quantification in the collection and analysis of data. Others describe qualitative research in a similar way, as that which provides a non-numerical examination and interpretation of observations for the purpose of discovering underlying meanings and patterns of relationships. While qualitative and quantitative approaches are often contrasted and presented as separate research approaches and ways of collecting data, in reality they are often used to complement each other, something that we will look at in the coming weeks. However, it is useful to revisit and reflect on the differences between the two broad approaches. This animation by Chris Deddy from Harvard University in the US provides an understanding of these differences and can be used to reinforce the discussions within the Bryman textbook.
Have you ever been interviewed? Have you ever filled out a survey? If you've done both, then you've participated in qualitative and quantitative research. Come on, pack up your bags and get on the bus, because we're about to journey through qualitative and quantitative research. Ba-da-da-da! Welcome to another Journey with Chris, where we will obtain new levels of knowledge and awesomeness. Hello scholars, today we're going to journey through the basics of qualitative and quantitative research. On our journey, we're going to compare the characteristics of both kinds of research, including their purpose, research questions, hypothesis, data analysis, and final reports. Let's talk about the purpose of both types of research. The purpose of qualitative research is to explore the meaning of people's experiences, the meaning of people's cultures, the meaning of how people view a particular issue or case, known as a case study. But the purpose of quantitative research is to examine the relationship between variables. Let's define a variable. A variable is a characteristic. We'll talk more about this in just a second. But for this class, we're going to learn about three kinds of variables: independent, dependent, and extraneous. Independent variables are variables or characteristics that are manipulated by the researcher. Dependent variables are characteristics that are impacted by that manipulation of the independent variable. Extraneous variables are variables that are extraneous to what the researcher is really trying to focus on, and they're usually demographic information such as age, sex, race, ethnicity, things like that. So let's say a researcher makes a poster that says, "Hey, you probably got some of you or other people's pee or poop on your hands, so wash your hands." The researcher puts up that poster in one bathroom and doesn't put it in another bathroom. Then the researcher watches to see if more people wash their hands after peeing or pooping who were exposed to the poster compared to those who were not exposed to the poster. It turns out that more people washed their hands who went to the bathroom where the poster was. The independent variable in this study is the poster on the wall. It was manipulated by the researcher. The dependent variable was the characteristic of hand washing. It was the effect of there being or not being a poster in the bathroom. Some extraneous variables are the people in the bathroom's age, sex, race, ethnicity, and so on. The point of the study was to examine the relationship between these variables. More hand washing, the dependent variable, took place in the bathroom that had the poster, which was the independent variable. Let's talk about research questions. Since qualitative research is exploratory in nature, qualitative research questions usually start with the words what or how, since these words imply discovery or exploration. Excuse me. For example, a qualitative research question could be, what are college students' experience in trying to eat healthy on campus? Or, how do college students celebrate the subcultural holiday of 420? Because qualitative research is exploratory, it typically does not have a hypothesis, which is a prediction. In a nutshell, qualitative research tries to explore, not predict, participants' views. Similar to qualitative research, quantitative research questions can start with the words what or how, but they might also include the word does in the beginning of the question. In descriptive quantitative research, research questions ask how much, how often, what's the relationship between variables, what's the difference between the variables. For example, what percent of male college students wash their hands after using campus bathrooms, or what is the relationship between college student gender and hand washing practices after using campus bathrooms? In experimental research questions, this is where they might start with the word does, such as, does hand washing increase when a poster is placed in a campus bathroom? Compared to qualitative research, quantitative research does have hypotheses or predictions about what will happen in the study. Typically, in qualitative research, researchers collect more than one type of data in order to get a better, more holistic picture of what's going on in the field. The data used in qualitative research is almost always in what people say or their words. This data usually comes from interviews, documents like newspapers or journals, etc., observations, and audio-visual materials like videos or audio recordings. Researchers usually obtain multiple types of these kinds of data in order to answer a research question. All of this data comes from the field, which means the natural settings where participants are. In qualitative research, researchers go into the field and spend a lot of time there interviewing and observing the participants and their environments. It's also important to note that surveys or questionnaires are also known as instruments. Well, in qualitative research, there are no instruments, no surveys. In qualitative research, the researcher is the instrument. What this means is that the researcher acts as an instrument. The researcher is kind of like a living survey. They ask all the questions and make observations instead of relying on surveys to gather data. It's also important to note that a hallmark of qualitative research is its emergent design. This means that the way in which the study is conducted can change during the study. During qualitative research, it may become apparent that other forms of data from other groups of people should be included into the study. For instance, let's say that a researcher is studying college students' experience trying to eat healthy on campus. Originally, the researcher has planned to just interview a bunch of students, but let's say that during the interviews, the students keep talking about the ice cream area of the cafeteria and student union. How there's over 400 kinds of ice cream and you have to walk around the ice cream to get to the apples and on and about the ice cream bar. Well, the researcher hears enough students talk about this crazy ice cream bar that the researcher decides that observational data should be included in the study. She needs to see the ice cream bar for herself and see how it overshadows the apple bin. She needs to see why everyone's talking about this crazy ice cream bar. So the research design emerges and different kinds of data might be collected as the study goes on. The data for quantitative research is in the form of numbers. These numbers usually come from what people check off on instruments, which are surveys or questionnaires, or observational checklists and so on. So qualitative research looks at words, quantitative research looks at numbers. Let's talk about analysis. In qualitative research, analysis is all about creating themes. Researchers read their interviews, look at documents, observations, and audiovisual materials, and then they organize all of that data, all of those words, into themes. This can take a considerable amount of time. There are often pages and pages of interview transcripts to read. For example, let's say a researcher interviewed students about their experience eating healthy on campus. From the interview, there were over 80 pages of interview text to read. From those pages, the researcher was able to group the data or analyze the data, group it into three major themes, which were students believed that there was a lack of healthy options on campus, the students believed the healthy options were too expensive, and they felt that unhealthy options were just too tempting. It's important to note here that qualitative research is inductive in nature. That means that the research questions, the data collection, the analysis, and all that stuff is not based off of a theory or preconceived notions that the researcher has. The researcher lets the data speak for itself and form itself into themes without the bias of an existing theory or existing ways of thinking about things already. On the other hand, in quantitative research, analysis involves the use of statistics to crunch numbers and figure out what those numbers mean in terms of answering a research question. Qualitative research looks at themes, quantitative research and analysis crunches numbers, statistics. Quantitative research is also usually deductive. It's based from existing theories and information that's already out there to help form research questions and how data is collected and how it's analyzed. Let's talk about the final report. In qualitative research, the final report is usually narrative in nature. The authors will sometimes write in the first person. It's more interpretive, and it contains a lot of writing, and it has direct quotes from participants. The final reports for quantitative research are more rigid in form, and it's more in the form of a statistical report. In conclusion, there are noteworthy differences between qualitative and quantitative research in terms of their purpose, research questions, data analysis, and so on. And this video is just an intro to each style of research.
Like quantitative approaches, qualitative research embraces a number of fundamental methodologies for data collection. The Bryman textbook contains chapters dealing with the various approaches, including participant observation, qualitative interviewing, focus groups, and discourse analysis. And we'll look at some of these in the coming weeks. Participant observation is research in which the researcher immerses themselves in a social setting for an extended period of time, observing behaviour, listening to what is said, and asking questions. It is also often referred to as ethnography, which can be defined as a report on social life that focuses on detailed and accurate description rather than explanation. In Key Concept 19.1 in the Bryman textbook, it is suggested that both ethnography and participant observation draw attention to the fact that the researcher immerses themselves in a group for an extended period of time, observing behaviour, listening to what is said in conversations both between others and with the field worker, and asking questions. In this way, Bryman argues that both terms are used interchangeably. Like quantitative data collection, interviews can also form the part of the qualitative researcher's toolkit. In qualitative interviews, there is a distinction between the more structured approaches, such as self-completion surveys, and semi-structured or unstructured approaches. The semi-structured or unstructured nature of the qualitative approach can lead to a more nuanced and in-depth understanding of a given social context. Often sample numbers are smaller in qualitative interviewing, and the interview process is recorded on a voice recorder rather than on an interview form. If you've ever been involved in a market research discussion group about a consumer product or service, you have taken part in a focus group. The focus group method is a form of group interview in which there are several participants together with a moderator or a facilitator. Often there is an emphasis within the questioning on a particular issue or tight set of questions, and the group context allows the development of joint understandings about particular issues. As with qualitative interviewing, the output from focus groups is often in the form of digital voice recordings or sometimes videos. Whilst observing behaviour or actions can result in useful qualitative data, the analysis of discourse can also be useful. Discourse analysis emphasises the way versions of the world, of society, and events are produced within discourse, that is, within written or spoken communication or debate. In discourse analysis, language is seen as constituting or producing the social world and social meanings. In almost all cases, qualitative approaches to data collection analysis and thinking can be used to answer research questions that we may have chosen a quantitative approach to also address. As the following TED Talk by Ellen Isaacs alludes to, understanding issues like parking or developing consumer products can be researched using quantitative approaches, but equally, qualitative approaches may also give appropriate information.
Years ago, if you sat in front of a computer, this is what you would see. A blinking cursor waiting patiently for you to tell it what to do. If you wanted to see your files, you would type ls for list, and then it would show you your files like this. They'd all look the same, even though some might be text, some might be images. But now, if you want to see your files, you just open up the folder and you look. And you can see some are text, some are images, because they look that way. If you wanted to move a file from one folder to another, you would type mv for move, the name of the file, isaacsbio.doc, and then something like ... talks, which is the location of the destination folder, local, relative to the current folder. Now, you drag the file from one folder to another. We take this visual display of our files and folders for granted, but somebody had to think of that. At a time when everybody who used computers typed those kinds of cryptic commands, somebody had to first notice that this wasn't so easy, and second, think of a better way to do it. Someone had to think that you could draw little pictures of files and folders on the screen and manipulate them by dragging a little box around on the tabletop. Well, those people were Doug Engelbart and Alan Kay. Engelbart invented the mouse, and Kay invented what's called graphical user interfaces. At the time, Alan Kay worked at Xerox PARC in California, which is where I work today. And in 1971, he said, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And that's what he did. So this was at a time when computers looked like this. Giant boxes of technology in big rooms hooked up to these terminals, which is where you type those commands. They were very expensive, so you had to share them, and people would sign up for time on the computer. So it's not surprising that at a time like this, Ken Olsen, the head of a very big computer company called Digital, said, there's no way anyone would want a computer in the home. Somebody had to think that you could take all that technology and compress it into a little box that would sit on the desktop and it would be dedicated to just one person's use. So that's something we all take for granted now, but at the time that would be extravagant. Well, those people worked at Xerox PARC, and in 1973 they invented the Alto, the first graphical personal computer. And that led to the Apple Macintosh, the IBM PC, and now all the slick desktop, laptop, and tablet computers that we all use today. So we're here today talking about the best of what Broadway can be. And I think that the reason that I was invited here is that the organizers were hoping that some of that magic from the early park scientists is still lingering in the halls where I work, revealing to me a vision of where you will be in 20 years. Well, I'm afraid that hasn't happened. But there is one bit of park magic that I can share with you, and it has to do with a method that you can use to figure it out, called ethnography. So let's go back to the 1980s when a Xerox copier took up an entire room. There was another park scientist, Lucy Suchman, and she had the idea that maybe if you're building technology for people, you should watch them using it. So she decided to watch some people using a Xerox copier. She grabbed a couple of her colleagues from down the hall, and she asked them to make copies. So I'm going to show you a short clip of a video from this historic video of these two people making copies.
Place 1 to 50 originals. Well, wait a minute, I have 100 originals. Face up. Place all originals against the left wall. We want two-sided copies. Unload top paper tray. Now, do we want them collated? What? Reverse order the originals? You gotta be kidding. This is definitely a bug. Press start.
Does that relate to that?
Unload top paper
We didn't do
tray.
that. That's not this. That's not the paper tray. It doesn't say what the paper tray is, huh? So our first batch
Our first,
is SOL.
what is that?
Shit out of it.
Well, we sure did come up with a lot of paper.
So it turns out that those two people from down the hall are world-renowned computer scientists. One of them went on to win the equivalent of the Nobel Prize in computer science. So clearly the problem is not that the people are dumb, the problem was with the design of the copier. Today, it is now common practice for companies to do what's called usability testing. But back then, it wasn't done. Lucy Suchman had to think of it. And she went further. She realized that you could observe people, not just to figure out how to make their products easier to use, but also to figure out what products to build in the first place. So this practice of observing people in their natural environments to understand their needs is called ethnography. At the time, it was an academic practice. It grew out of anthropology. Lucy Suchman was the first one to apply it to industry. So even today, not everybody uses ethnography. Most companies will try to understand their customers' needs by asking them directly using tools like focus groups or surveys. But asking people to tell you what they want gets you only so far. As the anthropologist Margaret Mead said, what people say, what people do, and what people say they do are entirely different things. When people do their jobs or just any ordinary activity, much of what you do just becomes invisible to you. It's just what you do. But if you watch people, you start to realize a lot of times people are working around their tools. And it's these gaps or problems people work around that are opportunities for innovation. The thing is, a lot of times when you point them out to people, they'll say, well, sure, it's obvious that's a problem. But they don't think to tell you about it when you ask. To notice it, you have to get out and watch. So I like to think of my job as an ethnographer like this. You sit and you watch the chaos that is human behavior. And if you're patient and you watch for a while and you have a naive state of mind, you start to notice insights that are obvious after you point them out. You start to notice the hidden obvious. Well, how does this work? What is ethnography like? Well, let me give you two examples from my work. So the last couple of years, I've been studying parking. Now, I realize parking is an odd place to go looking for technology opportunities. But we all know, New Yorkers especially, that parking is an area where there's a lot of problems and a lot of needs not being met. So to study parking, my colleagues and I have spent a lot of time hanging around on street corners, watching cars parking, trucks unloading, enforcement officers giving tickets. And we've seen a lot of things you might expect and some that you might not. So one of the things that we started to notice gradually was the parking signs and how difficult it can be to tell the one thing you want to know quickly, can I park here now, in the few seconds you have as you're driving by. So I'm going to show you a sign for about that amount of time, and I want you to figure out, can you park here now? Let's say it's Wednesday, early in the morning, it's 7 a.m. Can you park here now? Okay, let's look again. Okay, this is hard not just because there's so much going on, but you'll notice that Wednesday is not mentioned and 7 a.m. is not in any of the time ranges. So you have to infer that because it's not covered, you can park here, at least to the left of the signs. Okay, here's another one. It's 3 p.m. Can you stop here now? Okay, let's look again. So the bottom sign says no parking at 3 p.m. So that implies that you can stop. And the top, no stopping sign, doesn't cover 3 p.m. So that implies, again, you have to figure out that you can stop here. Okay, and here's one more where I challenge you to figure out what you can do here at any time. So the problem here is that parking signs focus on restrictions. Know this, know that, when what you want to know is what you can do. Now, when I say it like this, it seems obvious. But when you go and you ask people to tell you what are some of your problems you have with parking, they generally don't go complaining and saying, you know, parking signs are difficult to read quickly as you drive by because they focus on restrictions. To really understand this, you have to get out and watch. And it can take a while. Because we were looking at so many different aspects of parking, the signs didn't really come into focus for us until the fourth city and over 1,000 photos and videos. Once we noticed it, it was obvious. So what could you do about this? Well, one thing you could do is redesign the signs. And so here's one possible way you could design that second sign. And it's on the right, you see it's organized by time of day, from morning through night. So at any time you can find now, and then you can just look to the right and see, can I park? Green, yes. Red, no. Orange, there's some kind of restriction. Like here, it's deliveries only. And if you want to be kind to internationals, you could include symbols. Okay, so that's one example of how ethnography found an unmet need. Let me give you another one. So we noticed a lot of times when we were out looking that there were a lot of loading zones marked by yellow curbs that weren't being used. here we are looking for a parking spot, and it's just loading as far as the eye can see, and not very many trucks using it, and yet we can't park. On the other hand, we saw a lot of times when trucks were trying to make deliveries and couldn't find a loading zone. And since they have to park near where they're going to be delivering, they get creative. So they double park, and they block in cars, both diagonal and parallel. They park in the median, blocking cars from turning left. They park in the crosswalk, blocking people from crossing the street. And they park on the sidewalk. So the problem here is that loading zones take up precious parking resources, and yet they don't really meet the need. Again, I point this out, seems obvious, but when we talk to people about their parking problems, they don't say loading zones are inefficient, they say there's not enough parking. So what can you do about this? Well, what you really like to do is to have the spots for loading when they're needed, and then make them available to everyone else when they're not. So this is something we're doing right now. We have built a prototype parking meter that can change its state from parking to loading, no parking in other states. And since trucks have GPSs, they have GPSs and they know where they're going, we can take a spot and change it from parking to loading, and then when they come and they park, they can put it back to parking. Okay, so what does all this have to do with Broadway? Well, what I'm trying to say is that while I don't know what you need to do to make Broadway the best it can be, you can get some ideas by using ethnography. It's a very general tool. We've used it in many different domains: hospitals, nursing, call centers, retail stores, young people using mobile devices, lots more, and you could use it on Broadway. So you could accompany a family as they're spending a day out on Broadway. Or you could watch someone as they're planning a day or an evening for a night out and a show. Or you could just hang out at the tickets booth and watch people buying tickets, or people checking into hotels, or people choosing a restaurant, or window shopping, or going to a show, all those things. And maybe if you're patient and you do it for a while and you keep a naive state of mind, maybe you will discover the hidden obvious. Maybe you'll be the one to think of a novel idea that people will take for granted in 20 years. Thank you.
Now, during our discussion of quantitative approaches to data collection and research, we discussed the various pros and cons that may lead to particular approaches being adopted in any given research project. However, it shouldn't be surprising that there are also pros and cons associated with qualitative research approaches, and this is where I want to turn to now. Now, Bryman in the textbook talks about a number of the advantages of using qualitative approaches in any particular research project, and discusses these four main ones. The fact that qualitative approaches can provide with a different viewpoint onto a subject, that qualitative approaches see that context is important, that qualitative approaches are better able to identify process, and that qualitative approaches generally are much more flexible. Now, considering the first point, as Bryman discusses, an underlying premise of qualitative research is that the subject matter of social sciences, that is, the people, the groups we interview or research, are fundamentally different from what occur in natural sciences. In particular, unlike the subject matter of the natural sciences, the subject matter of the social sciences are capable of attributing meaning to their context, social world, and environment. And for this reason, qualitative researchers favour approaches that allow them to view events and the social world through the eyes of the people that they're studying. And this is in sharp contrast to what happens in quantitative approaches. Now, as far as context is important, qualitative researchers are much more inclined than quantitative researchers to provide a great deal of descriptive detail when they are reporting on their findings. Many researchers, when presenting their findings, provide a detailed account of what goes on in the setting being investigated, and often these seem to be full of apparently trivial details. However, these details are frequently important because of the significance for the subjects, and also because the details provide an account of the context within which the people's behaviour is taking place. So therefore, researchers argue that qualitative approaches allow you to get a much clearer picture of the outcomes because you also take into account context. When qualitative researchers emphasise the fact that process is important, they argue that using a qualitative approach allows you to view social life in terms of process in a way that approaches which are located in more quantitative field can't really do. In participant observation, for example, the qualitative researcher is able to better understand processes which have led to particular outcomes, because often the researcher is immersed in the social setting for long periods of time, providing a more in-depth understanding of processes and change. One of the noted advantages of qualitative research is that they offer much more flexibility than is the case with quantitative approaches. Qualitative researchers argue that the research approach should not entail the use of predetermined formats on the social world. That is, the approach that qualitative researchers use tends to be much more unstructured and flexible. They argue that problems occur if a structured method of data collection is employed, as this is bound to be a product of the investigator's reflections about the object of inquiry, therefore potentially causing biased outcomes and interpretations. Researchers also contend that the unstructured nature of qualitative approaches allows the prospect of flexibility. The researcher can change directions of the research as time unfolds to address the changing nature of any social setting. Now, countering these arguments are those made by researchers who point out that, like all research approaches, qualitative research has potential pitfalls that need to be considered when choosing a research approach and designing the research process. Now, the Bryman text goes into these in detail, but the main criticisms include the fact that qualitative research tends to be too subjective, that it's difficult to replicate, that drawing any generalizations from the research findings can be difficult, and that qualitative research lacks transparency. Now, considering the first point, researchers who criticize qualitative approaches sometimes do so on the argument that the unsystematic approaches that qualitative researchers use to identify important or significant research findings means that the findings are often clouded by the subjectivity of the researcher. Now, this is contrasted with quantitative approaches that usually follow some form of systematic statistical approaches and develop questions and approaches in a more explicit and structured way. The second point is important for quantitative researchers because they argue that because of the unstructured nature of qualitative approaches, they are very difficult to replicate. Now, unlike quantitative approaches, qualitative approaches often lack standard procedure and rely on the researcher as the main data collection instrument. This means that what is observed or heard and the focus of the data collection is driven by the researcher's preferences and not by standardized approaches, as in the case of quantitative research. The third point is that it is often suggested that a problem with qualitative approaches is that the findings tend to be too limited. Because of the approaches taken and the sample size and sampling techniques that qualitative researchers use, it is almost impossible to know how the findings can be generalized to a wider population. Now, in the text, Bryman asks, how can just one or two cases be representative of all cases? Or how can we treat interviewees who have not been selected through a probability sampling procedure as being representative? Now, the final criticism Bryman deals with is related to a lack of transparency associated with qualitative approaches. Because of the approach taken in qualitative research, it is often difficult to know exactly what the researcher did or how they arrived at their conclusions. Now, this is contrasted with quantitative approaches, which, as we've seen in the past, tend to be much more structured, planned, and generally have a much greater level of transparency. Now, to finish off with, I want to draw on a scene from the Dead Poets Society. Now, as you watch it, you should reflect on the potential for qualitative approaches to provide a different take on a particular question or problem.
Gentlemen, open your text, page 21 of the introduction. Mr. Perry, will you read the opening paragraph of the preface entitled Understanding Poetry?
Understanding Poetry by Dr. J. Evans Pritchard, Ph.D. To fully understand poetry, we must first be fluent with its meter, rhyme, and figures of speech. Then ask two questions. 1, how artfully has the objective of the poem been rendered? And 2, how important is that objective? Question 1 rates the poem's perfection. Question 2 rates its importance. And once these questions have been answered, determining the poem's greatness becomes a relatively simple matter. If the poem's score for perfection is plotted on the horizontal of a graph, and its importance is plotted on the vertical, then calculating the total area of the poem yields the measure of its greatness. A sonnet by Byron might score high on the vertical, but only average on the horizontal. A Shakespearean sonnet, on the other hand, would score high both horizontally and vertically, yielding a massive total area, thereby revealing the poem to be truly great. As you proceed through the poetry in this book, practice this rating method. As your ability to evaluate poems in this manner grows, so will your enjoyment and understanding of poetry.
Excrement. That's what I think of Mr. J. Evans Pritchard. We're not laying pipe. We're talking about poetry. How can you describe poetry like American Bandstand? Well, I like Byron. I give him a 42, but I can't dance to it. Now, I want you to rip out that page. Go on. Rip out the entire page. You heard me. Rip it out. Rip it out! Go on. Rip it out! Thank you, Mr. Dalton. Gentlemen, tell you what, not just tear out that page, tear out the entire introduction. I want it gone. History. Leave nothing of it. Rip it out. Rip! Be gone, J. Evans Pritchard, Ph.D.
Okay, so that's it for this week. You should read and review Chapter 17 of Bryman, and hopefully I'll see you during the class.